Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Inept General bringing you another Total War Warhammer Legendary Lord lore video, and today we are going to be looking at Malus Darkblade. Malus has a lot of lore about him. In fact, there are several, or I think even 5 or 6 books about Malus Darkblade, and as such, I've decided to break up the story of Malus Darkblade into multiple different parts. This is part 1. I think there are going to be probably 4 or maybe a push 5 parts for this Malus story, so do stay tuned for the rest of it. But this is looking at more of the early days of Malus Darkblade in part 1. So without further ado, let's kick on with the beginning of his tale. Malus awoke, his head splitting in agony. His mouth tasted of vomit and warm garbage. It seems that Malus found himself in a prison cell, as flashes of the previous night's antics began to flood back to him. As he recalled, the previous day hadn't started particularly well. A snake had emerged from his wardrobe, biting 2 of his servants and landing a strike on Malus's thigh. Luckily enough, the venom from the serpent had largely been extinguished by the time it managed to reach Malus after killing both of his pleasure servants. No doubt he thought some kind of gift from one of his half-siblings, as it seemed that the latest development in Malus's life had led to it being somewhat of an open season on his very life. Malus was about to embark on what is known as the Hackseer, or so roughly translated as the Sea Cruise, a coming-of-age ceremony for Dark Elf nobles, or Druchii nobles if you prefer. It involves really renting out a ship, a crew, some corsairs, to go raiding, and the bounty of the raid is entirely given unto the new noble, really allowing them to build up a fortune to establish themselves within Dark Elf society. But for Malus, this meant something very different. For the first time in his life, he was away from Hackseer for a significant amount of time. No longer under the protection of his mother, Eldri, the sorceress, who many years ago had done a deal with the Volkir of Hackseer, Lurhan Fellblade, to free her from a sorceress's life, and she would promise to serve him for the rest of her days, as long as he also provided one additional service to give her a son. And so this military lord of the city of Hackseer agreed to these conditions, and so Malus was born. But Lurhan never particularly liked his bastard son, and so this is how Malus in fact got his last name, Darkblade, a name often given to bastard children within Dark Elf society. And so with a father who saw Malus as a threat to his legitimate children and never particularly liked him as he grew into being a man, and a mother who was far away and no longer able to protect him from the machinations of a Druchii court, Malus was for the first time left on his own, and so that night had decided to drown his sorrows and seemingly resign himself to some kind of murderous end he would no doubt meet on this voyage. With that in mind, Malus that evening had started drinking, and drinking heavily. He remembered getting into some kind of dice game at a local establishment, which, of course, he used his wits and cunning to cheat at. Now, Malus is no fool. If he can win unfairly, he'll win unfairly. But in his drunken stupor, he got a little bit sloppy and was caught. This ended up in a fight with some drunken sailors, which attracted the attention of the city guard. Malus managed to give the city guard the slip, and in his drunkenness decided to ride home from the port city of Karankar. He got about half a mile out of town before the guards managed to catch up with him. Still unwilling to surrender and putting up a fight, he managed to knife 2 guards in the fracas, and thus Malus found himself in this cell. Having remembered some of last night's actions, Malus managed to drag himself up from the floor to a seated position in his cell, head still pounding away. It wasn't but a few moments later that a massive Druchii knight walked into the room and placed a heavy purse of coin into one of the guard's hands. The guard and the knight walked towards Malus's cell and promptly undid it. His father may not like him, but he wouldn't have his son missing his haxia wasting away in a prison cell in Clarkerond. So Malus, bailed out effectively by one of his father's cronies no doubt, was released from his cell. The two of them marched onto the streets of Clarkerond, the chief shipyard of the Witch King. The city was bustling as they mounted horses and began to ride towards the dock. Malus noticed that this knight was at least a head taller than Malus himself, and much broader than the young Druchii. But his armor was old. Malus guessed perhaps armor from around the time of his grandfather, with two twin blades on either hip. "Who are you?" Malus asked, with the disdain audible in his voice. "I am Sylar Thornblood, your sworn man, my lord." "Ha! Bought and paid for by my father, no doubt." Sylar, the knight, seemed to stiffen at this thought. Had Malus managed to offend this knight? What a bizarre thought in Dark Elf society that such a suggestion should offend. Is this knight possibly a good man, Malus thought to himself. No, in retrospect, what self-respecting knight would serve a noble such as he? And his suspicions only grew from there. The two rode out to the docks. Malus knew his father, although not liking him, had made at least the minimal arrangements expected of a noble father, and that is arranging for a crew and a boat to take him out on his haxia or sea cruise this coming-of-age ceremony. The two arrived at the pier upon which their ship was docked. The ship itself was called the Manticore, an old ship, but had been recently refurbished and had been given new armament. My father's money, no doubt, Malus thought to himself as he started to climb on board. Then, Malus suddenly found himself on the last step. One more step and he'd be on the boat. One more step and there'd be no turning back. He knew this haxia would provide his father with the perfect opportunity to kill him and have no word of exactly how he died reach his mother. This was an opportunity he knew his father couldn't pass up. For Malus was very aware of the way that Druchii courts worked, the assassinations, the plotting, the schemes. In fact, even though he was relatively young for a dark elf, he was very familiar with how to avoid the dangers of court, having constantly been in peril as his father's least liked child. He knew an attempt would be made. A more intelligent elf probably would have fled already by this point, but Malus gathered his courage and simply shouted back to Sylar, "Grab my things, will you, and get on board." The most likely culprit for his father's assassin was probably this knight, and he vowed to himself to try and find a way to kill this Sylar as soon as possible. Once on board, Malus met the captain, a man by the name of Gull. He was as slick as an eel, with a katan, or as we would call it, a robe, made of human flesh, draped around his shoulders. He wore normal corsair garb, and he had a mouth filled with gleaming golden teeth, and rings decorated his every finger. "Captain," Malus said, "it's an honor to host you, my dear lord," replied Gull. "But for this voyage, you shouldn't call me captain. The moment you stepped on board, you were the captain of this vessel, Lord Malus." Then he was introduced to the rest of the key members of the crew. As everyone gathered around, they all gave him cold, predatory stares, but it's nothing that one didn't become used to in Dark Elf society. First off was the first mate, a tall, fit woman with dusky skin from a life at sea. Lunara Ithil was her name, and she had fine, pale battle scars all over her skin. She had very high cheeks, and her hair was done in the manner of dozens of fine braids draping across her shoulders. She also had a pair of swords on her hips, and Malus noted that she was a particularly attractive woman. Next up was the second officer. His name was Amaleth. His gaze was direct and challenging, and he also was dressed in corsair garb. There was also the navigator Shebel. Now, he was a ratty man with poxmarked skin and, rodenty red eyes. Malus never took a particular liking to him. And so as Malus was on board his ship, the Manticore, the crew all knelt and gave him their vows. Through wind, storm, red rain, and splintered shield, I will serve thee, Captain, lead, and I will follow. As the beautiful first mate rose from taking her vows, their eyes met, and Malus blurted out, "Perhaps I'll lead you to my cabin," upon which he was swiftly struck in the face by the first mate. Sylar moved to Malus's side, drawing a blade to protect his sworn lord, but as was the law aboard these ships, she was well within her rights to act the way she did, and no further action was taken against her. And so, looking to the horizon, Malus gave the order, and the Manticore set sail. As they set off on their voyage, Malus spent time gambling with the crew, often pulling them off their duties to do so, but they managed to avoid him socially. They didn't really want to interact with this highborn lord who had hired them out for this haxia. As he was gambling with them and socializing to a certain degree, Malus was studying the crew, trying to ascertain who was the assassin if it wasn't Sylar. Perhaps that was too obvious a choice. Sylar, in his own right, disapproved of Malus's behavior on board the ship, but after a time began to get used to it. Then, at one point during the voyage, Captain Gull summoned Malus to his cabin. They had to plot their destination and where they would go raiding. Coming into the room, the captain gave Malus his pitch. They had a crew not large enough to take any sort of big cities or large towns, but they could hit a number of towns along the Bretonnian border, amassing a huge amount of money. Now, Malus considered this plan, looked over it, listened to the captain's plan silently, and then simply responded with no. "We are going to go to Ulthuan," as he lay his finger down on the sea chart. "What? Are you joking?" Captain Gull said. "That would be suicide. The patrol ships, the defense of the High Elves, the fact that they're always looking out for us coming ashore and are very eager to kill us, would make this a suicide run. That's madness. We don't have the crew to take really any elven town. These silly human settlements are easy pickings compared to the fortifications we would find on Ulthuan. You are a madman." "But I'm captain of the ship," Malus insisted, and he gave his order. They were going to head to Ulthuan, home of the High Elves. After this meeting, Malus retreated to his cabin, where he found Sylar waiting in one of the corridors. Instinctively, Malus reached for his blade, thinking this was the moment Sylar would choose to strike him down. "What in the Dark Mother's name do you want?" Malus said. Sylar, glaring at him intensely. "What in the name of all the gods is wrong with you?" he said to Malus. "Were you dropped on your head as a child? Kicked by a horse? Mother's cursed. Master Gull offered you easy pickings and rich rewards, and you turned him down for a suicide mission? Would you rather die?" "Mind your tongue," Malus retorted. "Another word and I'll have the first mate flay your back." Sylar did not retreat. "You don't know how to sail. You waste time gambling. It doesn't make sense that you would throw all these opportunities away with your advantages." "Advantages?" Malus shouted back at Sylar. "Is the cheese in the trap an advantage to the rat?" As he started to walk past the heavily clad knight. Sylar backed down from his aggressive stance. He explained to Malus over the course of the evening why he was so mad at him. He'd had none of the advantages Malus had. He'd once come from a great house, but due to a conflict his grandfather got into with Malus's father, they had basically been rendered destitute. This explained why the knight's armor seemed so old. It was in fact the armor of his grandfather. He could not afford a suit for himself. For he came from a house with no prospects and no patrons, and was common in all but name. There would be no haxia for him, no plunder, no raiders. He was a knight fated only to follow. Once they'd had this heart-to-heart for a little bit of time, there was a knock on the door, and it was the beautiful first mate. "How did you do it?" she asked him. Malus understandably a little bit confused. How did you manage to avoid assassination? How did you know Captain Gull had done a deal with a Bretonnian lord to entrap and kill you? That was very well observed and very well avoided, Lord Malus. Malus, not giving anything away, simply said, how did you end up on this ship, as he tried to engage the first mate in some kind of tit-for-tat casual conversation. She explained that she had got a taste for war with Malekith's last invasion, and since then she could not return to a highborn life. She was from this day till the end of her days a warhound. Now she'd given him a bit of information that she wanted him to answer the question. How did you avoid the trap? Well, I looked at the map, and Ulf-1 was only half the distance away. Absolutely flabbergasted by this answer, the three of them got to talking. And over the course of the evening, Malus eventually said, I believe we all have a vested interest in my continued survival. How so? Lenara, the first mate, questioned. I represent an opportunity. Alone, my chances of survival are pretty slim. The chance any of us survive Ulf-1, slimmer still. But I have need of retainers, and I'm pretty rich and can present you with a number of opportunities if we survive this entire mess. We're not going to Bretonnia, we're heading to Ulf-1, and the captain will be off balance as long as we stay the course united. Sylar immediately swore to be at Malus's side, for he saw an opportunity to perhaps reinstate his house down the line, and Lenara was a bit more hesitant. She said she needed a bit more time to consider it. But as she left Malus's cabin, she did say this. This is not the first time Gull has dealt with an unwanted son. There will be a backup, an assassin. And with that, she left the cabin. All in all, it was a week until they reached the Blighted Isles on the northern coast of Ulf-1. Malus had continued to gamble with the crew on and off, and had lost a substantial amount of coin, all in all, maybe intentionally, to try and brighten the morale of the crew. As dawn rose, they cornered the Blighted Isle. A cry went up from Lenara, the first mate. Sail spotted! Gull suggested to Malus that they escape. They could not stealthily approach Ulf-1. They had already been seen. Malus, looking to the horizon, growled, escape? Back at Gull? They're the ones trying to escape from us. We can catch it. He looked across to Lenara, the first mate, that they actually could accomplish this feat. She nodded at him in silent approval. Lower the sails and start rowing or whatever it is you do, Malus shouted at the crew as they began to close the distance between the two vessels. By mid-morning, they'd managed to close the distance a bit. Gull had warned that this could all be a trap that the opposing vessel was leading them into. As they closed the distance between the two vessels, the High Elf ship began to fire bolts back at the Druchii pursuers. Malus grinned like a wolf. Things were getting interesting now, as he ordered the Manticore to return fire, their repeater crossbows letting loose upon the fleeing High Elves. The first hits were met with rapturous cheers from the Dark Elf crew. Bolts flew between the two ships for the remainder of the morning. One huge bolt split a rail on the Druchii ship, as Druchii, within a 15-yard radius of the impact, began to scream out. The railing had splintered, and the surrounding corsairs had been peppered with shrapnel, their arms and faces pierced by the wood of their own ship. Pitch pots went up a cry, and in retaliation the Druchii coated one of their bolts with pitch, setting it aflame and letting it fly. It soared through the air, piercing the sheet of the High Elf sail, setting it ablaze. The two vessels exchanged volleys, and soon the sound of metal hitting flesh could be heard all around them. Malus was sprayed with the blood of a Druchii, who let out a gurgling scream, not but a few paces away. Another Druchii fell to the deck, his left arm and shoulder severed from his torso. One of the High Elf bolts even seemed to ricochet amongst several of the corsairs, rendering each one to pulp in turn. Lenara let out a cry of, "Don't bunch up and dark your heads when the bolts are incoming. You won't be able to fight with a splinter in your eye," as the hot pursuit continued. For 10 minutes, their two ships exchanged fire. The the air thick with Druchii crossbow bolts and azure arrows. The deck reeked of blood and entrails, but they had achieved their goals as they were pulling right up to the elven ship. "Prepare for boarding," a cry went out. "Hooks and lines to starboard!" Malus had found himself next to Lunara, who looked at him and with a glint of bloodlust in her eye, said, "Now we go to work. Gold and glory." The grappling hooks flew as they brought the two ships slamming together. Lunara and Malus jumped over the ship joined by their corsairs. Sylar, like Malus, made the leap in full plate armor, which was a risky endeavor in a naval battle, as falling into the water would inevitably result in drowning. They were met with the ever-disciplined High Elves, who on the far side of their own deck had formed a shield wall. "Charge the shield wall!" screamed Malus as he went running into the High Elf enemy. He managed to knock aside the first spear, hacking at the hand of its holder, separating finger from hand. As the High Elf screamed, Malus's pommel drove straight into his face. Slashing wildly, Malus screamed incoherent curses as he managed to catch the next High Elf in the throat with his blade, cracking against the helm of his neighbor as he continued to kill one after the other. The sail above them had been set ablaze by their pitched bolts, and now embers fell on the High Elf deck like burning rain as the slaughter continued. The High Elves met with the ferocity of the corsairs, fell back to their main mast, encircling it, and Malus fell upon them as they were trying to regroup. The nearest High Elf to him struck out with his spear, grazing it against Malus's breastplate. Malus feinted for the High Elf's head before striking low and taking out his knee, hobbling the High Elf before driving a blade into his left eye. The body went limp and almost toppled Malus. Blood was spilling all around him as the other corsairs joined in the fray. The enemy retreated further back to the bow of the ship, as Malus took a moment and rested as he leant against the main mast. As he looked around at the bodies that scattered the deck, one particular spearman caught Malus's eye. "So similar to us, but yet so foul," Malus thought to himself. In that moment, inspiration struck, and he knew how they would breach an elven city's walls. Just then, Sylar approached with a curt nod, "My lord," followed by Lunara, who said that the enemy captain had fallen and that the ship was theirs. What should they do now? Malus said, "Get some sailors and start collecting the bodies of the spearmen. We need to take them to the Manticore." For a moment, it looked like Sylar might object, but instead he turned and shouted to a nearby group of Druchii to carry out the order. Malus inspected the bodies that they were taking, making sure to take those whose gear was most intact. They'd managed to select half a dozen and began dragging them back to the ship. Malus and Sylar chose two more and followed as quickly as they could. Around them, the other Druchii were looting the corpses of their High Elf cousins and taking anything of value they could carry. As they got to the railing, a horn went off from the Manticore itself. Malus handed over the body and said, "Come back over and we'll go and pick up some more," as he ran into the ever-thickening smoke of the High Elf ship. As he turned around, he was aware that Sylar tried to tell him something, but there was no time for idle chit-chat. Malus was looking for a captain, some high-ranking officer on the vessel, as the smoke began to sting his eyes. He was coughing now as he looked up and realized Sylar was nowhere near him. There were no Druchii left on the ship. He was the only one. Panic started to set in on him. He began to run back towards his own ship. Someone had cut the cables and the Manticore was already a yard away. Malus, considering the heavy armor he was already wearing, had no choice but to sprint and jump, knowing that to delve into the sea would surely seal his fate. He slammed into the side of the Manticore, managing to grasp at the bottom of a railing, his legs dangling into the cold sea. He'd barely made it. Sylar hauled Malus back up over the railing and onto the deck. Malus screamed out, "Mother's curse! What the hell happened there?" And Sylar explained that the horn was a signal that there was an enemy ship on the horizon. Just then, the first mate approached and said, "What's this?" pointing to Malus's back. Malus, having not a real clue what she was talking about, said, "I don't know. I don't have eyes in the back of my head, woman." She pulled out what was a Druchii bolt from a crossbow. Someone had tried to take a shot at him during the melee. This was surely the bolt of an assassin on board. Gull began to approach the group And Malus thought to himself, Gull, you almost had your way. If I'd realized a minute later that no one else was on board the High Elf ship with me, I'd have surely perished on the flaming ship or drowned in the waves below. Good attempt, sir, but you didn't get me on this one. Gull said they were going to hide in the mists of the Blighted Isle. It was their best asset now to avoid a fight with this High Elf ship on the horizon. Why couldn't they just take it head on, Malus asked. They had the wind advantage, they were a larger vessel with more bolt throwers on board. There was no way they could win under these conditions. So Malus agreed with the plan to hide in the mists, but then he had a thought. Won't they be expecting us to retreat to our homeland, he asked of Gull. Gull said, yes, of course, that's what we're going to do. I told you this was a suicide run. You're being very reckless with my ship, Lord Malus. To which Malus replied, you're being reckless with the manner in which you talk to me. What we're going to do is this. We will hide in the mists and then attack the shores of Ulthuan. The plan had worked and Malus and the Corsairs had made it to shore. Approximately 100 Corsairs were in the raiding party, 2/3 of the crew. 1/3 remained behind with Captain Gull to guard the ship, and the other 100 would mostly wait in ambush as Malus and a few of the best fighters donned the gear of the fallen High Elves from the patrol boat they had sunk and marched towards the coastal town. Sylar was among the group and was whispering to Malus as they approached the town, I can't believe we're doing this. Neither can I, said Malus. This was your idea. I wasn't positive I'd lived this long into the plan, retorted Malus. The group approached the town. The turquoise lamplights on the wall had been lit, signifying that the town had been alerted to the Druchii presence. This was presumably from the patrol boat that had been hunting them earlier. As they got nearer the town, they heard a cry from on top of the wall, Who goes there? Malus shouted up to the captain of the guard. We were just dropped further upshore. We're here searching for Druchii. May we enter? We look for a place to rest our feet and get some food. There was a long pause as the gate guard discussed the issue amongst themselves, but what threat could this little group of 7 patrolling High Elves be to the gate itself? And so, they were allowed in, hearing the massive locks on the gate be undone and the gate creak open. The 7 of them marched in, doing their best High Elf impressions, and they made it into the gate. It wasn't until they were approached in greeting by one of the High Elves that the cry went up from them, Blessed Mother of the Night, as he'd made eye contact with Malus and seen the Dark Elves' dark eyes. At them! At them! Screamed Malus as the Dark Elves drew their blades. The High Elves had truly been taken by surprise, and many of them didn't even have their weapons to hand when Malus gave the call to attack. The one nearest to him turned his back to Malus and started to run towards his weapon, which was some distance away. Malus reversed the grip on his spear and hurled it towards his enemy elf, hitting him square between the shoulder blades, killing the elf instantly. Malus, to his left and right, Sylar and Linara shed their disguises, drawing their blades, slashing at the nearest High Elf. Stay at the gate, Malus shouted. They had to hold the gate for the rest of the Corsairs to charge through, but for now, it would be 7 against 40. The first few High Elves who had been taken by surprise, the Dark Elves managed to cut down easily enough, but as soon as they started to regroup, they put pressure on Malus and his small band. Sylar took a spear to his shoulder. Malus, turning quickly, slashed at the arm of the offending High Elf, severing it from the elbow as a gush of streaming blood sprayed all over Malus. As he was pulling the spear from Sylar's shoulder, another High Elf thrust his spear at Malus, Malus using his stolen shield to parry the blow and stab his own blade into his enemy's guts. As the elves began to regroup, they formed a shield wall, and a thicket of thrusting spears drove Malus and his small band back in towards the gate. He noticed out of the corner of his eye a trio of High Elves running to his right. They were going for the gate. If they shut the gate doors, they could effectively use the wooden barrier to force the Dark Elves out. Malus went to address this threat, only to be struck in the helm, causing it to twist and obscure his vision. Malus couldn't move the unfamiliar helmet quick enough, and he felt a searing pain in his left leg as a spear ran through it. Falling to a knee, Malus then took another hit to his armor and collapsed on the ground. The shuddering force of the hit had caused his helm to go flying, and it was at that moment Malus thought to himself, perhaps this wasn't such a good idea after all. But he felt a slight sensation underneath him of the ground rumbling, and just at that moment, screaming corsairs jumped over him, hacking their way into the High Elf lines. His reinforcements had made it. The town was theirs. The corsairs rampaged through the town, carrying out their usual slaughter and defilement as they went. By the time the smoke settled, and Malus had had his wound tended to, they'd taken 3 wagons of plunder and some 30 slaves, and only suffered light losses in the process. Malus, his corsairs, and their caravan of plunder and slaves made their way back to the coastline to rendezvous with the Manticore. But the Manticore was late. They'd been stuck on this strip of beach for some time, awaiting their ship to come back and pick them up, and Malus had started to worry. It was for this reason he insisted on having Shebel, the navigator, join the shore party, because he knew Gull would struggle to make it back safely through the waters of Ulthuan without the ratty, poxmarked navigator by his side. He knew they were late, but he was still confident they were coming. But there was also the case of the other High Elf patrol ship that they had to be aware of, and that thought did linger at the back of Malus's mind. But then, later than expected, the Manticore did emerge out of the darkness, about a mile off the coast. They sent out the shoreboats to pick up Malus and his crew. Sailors and plunder first, we need to get the ship ready to depart, Malus gave the order. He didn't get on the first boat because he felt doing so in his wounded state would make him feel weak, and he didn't want to look weak in his moment of triumph. And so he would go with the second wave, including the rest of the troops and the slaves. It was taking hours to unload the cargo on the Manticore, and he was getting frustrated they hadn't returned to pick up the rest of the crew. Then there was a commotion from the back of the party. One of the spotters they'd laid out on the perimeter had returned. There was a column of High Elf spearmen marching up the coast. How could they have found us so quickly? We were in and out of that town like a flash. There's no way there can be reinforcement from the neighboring town already. Gulping in awe past Malus, the spotter pointed out to sea and said, "That's how." The High Elf patrol ship that had been hunting them came into view. No doubt they had dropped the troops off further along the shore to trap them in by land and sea. By the dark mother, Malus swore, when a flash of realization came over him. This was Gull's plan. He'd been stalling for time. And as though on cue, the sails of the Manticore unfurled. He had his sailors, and he had his plunder. He would even get the reward money from Malus's father for seeing him dead. He was abandoning Malus to his fate at the hands of the High Elves. The faint sounds of drums from the marching High Elves began to be heard by the group, and Malus could see the slaves stirring in excitement. Lenara turned to him. "What do we do now?" Malus paused for a moment, pensively. "We die." It only took the regiment of Laferne Sea Guard 10 minutes to reach the Druchii encampment point, and what they walked into was a scene of slaughter. The white sands of the beach had been turned black with blood. The bodies of dead Druchii laid all around them, some still holding the gory knives they'd used to turn on their would-be masters. These brave High Elves had done their duty before the Sea Guard had managed to finish off the filthy Druchii themselves. The commander of the Sea Guard ordered his troops to help the slaves up and get them covered and clothed. He knelt down to the closest free slave and said, "We came as soon as we could, cousin. You were very brave." "I know," replied Malus, as he drove a dagger into the sorrowful eye of the Sea Guard commander. Malus had laid his ambush. Some of the party had disguised themselves as slaves and set upon killing the Sea Guard, but yet others were fully armed and armored beneath the sand. The darkness of the blood had helped conceal them, as they emerged like sand creatures from the depth to slaughter those above. The slaves had been an expensive sacrifice, each worth their weight in silver, but it had been a necessary one. All the Druchii troops around started to slaughter the Sea Guard, who were caught completely unawares. The slaughtered bodies on the beach were simply the High Elf slaves they dressed in their uniforms and laid out for the Sea Guard to discover. They dispatched with this regiment fairly quickly, but now they needed to get back on the ship. There was still hope. Gull had messed up his plan, and the Manticore had been slow to take up the longboats, and the High Elf ship had caught up with them and been boarded. They could see the scene offshore. And Malus knew this contingent of High Elves had to get ashore somehow. Their boats must be positioned further south. If they can get get those boats and get back to the ship, they could retake the Manticore. They rode like hell up the road in their wagons and indeed found those longships on the shore. They boarded them and started to row, silencing as they approached the two vessels anchored together. Gull's skeleton crew had been decimated by the High Elves. He'd been overconfident in his plan and his ability to pull it off. But the High Elves themselves were overconfident, having already taken the Manticore. They never expected an attack from the shore. As Malus and his corsairs silently crept on to the High Elves' ship, they charged the High Elves from the rear as they were dealing with their Druchii prisoners. The High Elves never stood a chance against this swift surprise attack from their own boat, and quickly fell under the blades of Malus and his corsairs. The day had been won, and Malus was back on the ship, back with his plunder. He still needed to get home, however, and the crew which had turned against him, he managed to bribe with the plunder they'd taken from the High Elf town. Gull, who'd survived the High Elf attack, abased himself at the feet of Malus, begging for forgiveness. His pleas for mercy fell on deaf ears. As they sailed home, Malus tied Gull to the mast and vowed to slice a piece of him off every day as they sailed home. Gull lived in agony as the days of the trip unfolded. Eventually, as they neared their home waters and were sailing past Caron Car, Malus threw Gull overboard, offering him up to the sea witches. Malus had survived. He had made it home, but he had nothing to show for his haxia, save for a small coin purse that contained Gull's teeth. As he stood on the prow of the ship, playing with his new toys, Lenara came up to him and began to offer suggestions as to what he could do with them, including melting them into dice. Sylar approached on his other side. What happens when you get back home empty-handed and 3 months early? It doesn't really matter, Malus said. I could have come home dragging Teclis by the hair, and it wouldn't have mattered. My father would still have wanted me dead. He would have still looked down upon me. Not much in my situation has changed. Sylar, Malus turned to him and said, I misjudged you, Sylar. A poor knight you may be, and too honest for your own damn good, but you served me well. I'll release you from your oath here and now if you wish. You needn't accompany back to the den of vipers at Hagreth. Sylar chuckled, and missed the look on your father's face? No, my lord, I'll accompany you. Malus nodded and turned to Lenara. You, on the other hand, never gave me an oath. Gull is dead, and Amalith the second mate was killed in the battle off Ulthuan. By law, the Manticore is your ship now. True enough, the first mate said, but I'm done with sailing the seas. If you're still serious about taking me into your retinue, then I'll give you my oath, she smiled. But I expect to be well rewarded for my service. You may wind up with more than you bargained for, Malus joked. Speaking of bargains, Sylar interrupted. There's still the matter of who shot you on board the patrol boat off the Blighted Isle. Malus frowned. Ah yes, the hidden assassin in the crew. That was Amaleth, the second mate, I expect. I saw him with a crossbow just before the battle. It was him, right enough, Lenara interjected. I paid a couple of corsairs to shadow him during the battle. Her expression soured. They weren't supposed to let him get a shot off without my permission. Your permission? You knew Amaleth was the assassin the whole time? Of course, Lenara replied. I kept him alive as insurance, just in case you had any treachery in your own mind, Malus. What, did you think I would just take you at your word? Malus was rendered speechless, torn between murderous outrage and grudging admiration for the first mate. Sylar leaned against the rail and chuckled softly, staring out to sea. Will be the death of you yet, my lord, said the young knight. Sylar, this may be the beginning of a beautiful friendship. As Malus stared out to the horizon as they sailed the final stretch home. And that's about it for part 1 of the story of Malus, ladies and gentlemen. He will go on to have an encounter with a demon that will change his life forever, but I wanted to give you an idea of what the Druchii was like before the possession, before he lost his way. As always, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope to have part 2 out in the next week or so. Do keep your eyes peeled for that. Thanks for watching, and I hope to catch you all on the next one. Alright guys, bye.